Hello and welcome to this lesson on one of the 4 types of questions you'll find in the GMAT integrated reasoning section, two-part analysis. So let's begin by just talking about the question type and how frequently you'll see it. So you want to assume that there will be somewhere around 3 to 4 questions in the two-part analysis format for each 12-question integrated reasoning section. Now, you're going to always have a single slide containing a quantitative or verbal scenario to evaluate in 2 parts. So you'll have to make 2 selections for the slide, hence the name two-part analysis, and you have to get each part correct in order to gain credit for said slide. Now, the strategic implications are legion for two-part analysis within the integrated reasoning section. First, you want to assume about 3 minutes as your average per slide of two-part analysis questions. And the reason is they just have more information than some of the other question formats you'll encounter in the integrated reasoning section. So for that reason, we want to allocate a little bit more than the 2 minute and 30-second average overall for the section to these types of questions. But that said, you'll still want to adhere to a 4-minute maximum for any of these two-part analysis slides. Now, you'll have to read and identify the question, task, and subject for your two-part analysis slides first before going into the slide for the pertinent information. This is important because you have to decide what relevant tactic to apply from the problem-solving or verbal tactics that we discussed in the rest of this course. Your two-part analysis, some of them will be a verbal format, say something like a critical reasoning question or a reading comprehension question. There will be no sentence corrections. But then you can also encounter, and likely will encounter, more quantitative styled two-part analysis. So perhaps even a geometry scenario or an arithmetic or algebraic scenario. They are never going to stick to the same exact format, but you're going to recognize some of the topics and content matter from the verbal and quantitative sections in two-part analysis integrated reasoning questions. And this is the first type of question format on the integrated reasoning section that you will want to proactively skip if you're behind pace. So the two-part analyses, they do just take longer, as we've already articulated, and they are self-contained. So they will not affect a subsequent question. There will be no more questions after the individual slide pertaining to the scenario. So you can feel a little bit more comfortable skipping if you're falling behind in your pace these two-part analyses questions than, say, a multi-source reasoning question, which is tied to a multiple set of questions. So let's take a look at a problem-solving quantitative style example of a two-part analysis question on the integrated reasoning section. So we've got an example here on the left where Abby is doing some cycling, and we've got a little table where we'll have to select a couple of options for A and B. Now we're going to ultimately apply the exact same process for problem solving in the quantitative section to this integrated reasoning question. So to do that, we're going to start by just setting up the scratch pad, listing the choices vertically A to F, so 5, 6, 10, 12, 24, and 30, and you just have A and B over top to keep track of what you're being tasked to seek. Now, we then want to skip to the end of the problem to identify those sought values and label the choices as such. So again, A and B are ultimately going to be the A minutes and B minutes here that are going to result in the two friends cycling 80 total kilometers in 8 hours. And if we go back up to the beginning of the prompt, we'll see that that number of minutes A and B for friends to travel combined 80 kilometers is what we'd write out. Now, we're going to read from the beginning, taking notes and completing needed steps as we go. So we start by discovering that Abby cycles 500 meters in A minutes, and since we had the conversion rate already in the question of 1,000 meters is equal to 1 kilometer, we know that our 500 meters taking A minutes means that 1,000 meters, or 1 kilometer, will take 2 A minutes, and that's going to simplify what we have to do down the line. Then we find that Barry travels 800 meters in B minutes, or 0.8 kilometers in B minutes. And then we're told that Abby cycles faster than does Barry, and that if they each cycled at least 10 hours at their respective constant rates, a piece of information that isn't terribly helpful, but makes it so that none of the weird things happen where they're not cycling at a constant rate or they're not continuing for at least the duration as required. We want to find out which of the values for A and B are going to result in those two friends cycling 80 kilometers in 8 hours. And we think critically and determine that the speed at which they'll have to travel combined is going to be 10 kilometers per hour. And again, we want to get everything out of meters and into kilometers because that is the format and the metric used by the actual task of the question. So then we want to consider our best possible tactic in the moment. We need to consider all 4 options, and we note some clues here. We see that the question is seeking a specific numeric value with real numbers in the choices in ascending order in this problem, and that means we should potentially consider back solving. And so what we'll do is begin with 10 minutes for A for Abby. And what that means is if Abby goes 500 meters in 10 minutes, that means that she goes 1,000 meters or a kilometer in 20 minutes, which means that she's going to go 3 kilometers per hour if she goes 500 meters in 10 minutes. But that's too slow because logically we know that since we needed that 8 kilometers per hour and Abby cycles faster than Barry, Abby has to go at least 5 kilometers per hour in order to be faster than Barry goes and reach a combined rate of 10 kilometers per hour. So that allows us to logically eliminate 10 and anything else that's greater than 10, as well as 6, because if Abby goes exactly 6 minutes for 500 meters, then she would take 12 minutes for a kilometer, which would be exactly 5 kilometers per hour, which again would result in her not cycling faster than Barry does. And so therefore, A can only be 5 minutes for 500 meters, which would then be 10 minutes for a kilometer, which, because 60 is 6 times 10, would mean a 6 kilometer per hour rate for Abby. And therefore, Barry has to produce a rate of 4 kilometers per hour. And we know one of the answer choices has to allow that as well. So if we then test out Barry's choices, we know that if Barry goes exactly 12 minutes for 800 meters, that means that he would produce 4,000 meters per hour, 4 kilometers an hour, and therefore our answers are Abby cycles 500 meters in 5 minutes and Barry cycles 800 meters in 12 minutes. So now that we've seen a quantitative 2-part analysis problem, let's take a look at a verbal reasoning example. So here we've got a relatively dense passage that we've got to evaluate, but we're still going to look at the answer or the question task first. And that says, if each of the above statements are true, we need to select a single statement that must be true about the U pick and one that must be false about the same U pick based on the information that's provided. I don't want to look at the answer choices, but I know that I'm just going to be asked to find something that absolutely has to be true and find something that absolutely has to be false. I can't predict it, and I'm going to have to do some cross-checking from the answer choices, which is part of why it's so important to allocate the time to work through this problem well and to not waste time on other questions in the integrated reasoning that should take you a little bit less time. Things like graphics interpretation, things like table analysis, because here there is no real shortcut except carefully reading and cross-checking. So generally, we do recommend that you read the paragraph up front to understand the scenario. And the U-Pick of Western Alaska recount different reasons for starting a war. A boy's game of darts gone terribly wrong, a deceitful murder during a seemingly companionable hunting trip. What followed is handed down in stories of many fierce battles, with arrows flying and tales of the tough and wily warriors who could withstand them. Bow and arrow warfare was widely prevalent among the Yupik up to about 1800 and did not end until Russians came to Alaska at the beginning of the 19th century. The Yupik tales of these violent confrontations have been kept alive for hundreds of years through careful retellings by the elders. They are considered reliable histories, unchanged since the first written accounts by non-natives. So, now we have to go to our answer choices and cross-check. And the first says the Russians were the first non-natives to encounter the Yupik. And we recall they mention the Russians, but they do not state that they were absolutely the first non-natives. So this neither must be true nor must be false. We just don't know based on the paragraph of information. However, if we look at the next answer choice, the Yupik kept extensive text accounts of their terrible battles. That we know not to be true because we find in the conclusion of the paragraph that the tales were kept alive through careful retellings by the elders of the Yupik, and they are considered reliable histories unchanged since the first written accounts were by non-natives. So therefore, it must be false that the Yupik kept extensive text accounts of terrible battles. They didn't take text accounts according to the passage. Now, war being a common occurrence within Yupik factions, we know that there was a war, but we don't know that it was a common occurrence, so that's neither must be true nor must be false. Then we've got this idea of foreign incursion forced the Yupik to change some conventions. And while this may seem to be something that was not discussed, we did find in the middle of the paragraph that bow and arrow warfare was widely prevalent among the Yupik up to about 1800 and did not end until Russians came to Alaska. So therefore, when the Russians, foreigners, came and incurred upon the land, the Yupik changed their warfare techniques. Therefore, choice D must be true. And then with the final option, Alaska was not the original homeland of the Yupik. There is nothing to indicate that, although they do mention the Yupik of being from Western Alaska at the beginning of the passage. So those are the two primary types of questions you'll find about two-part analysis. And so our process overall: first, you have to determine which verbal or quantitative tactics are applicable by reading and identifying the question task. Always go there before you start reading the information on the slide about the scenario. Then you've got to read what you need to address that question task. You do want to read carefully, and you want to note your problem solving and reading comprehension details as required to address whatever the task may be. Then you just simply have to execute your proper processes from the verbal or quantitative sections. So diligently perform your steps to avoid traps and maximize efficiency, because these do take some time. And also remember to use the provided interface calculator for those quantitative questions as is warranted. The calculations, again, for the integrated reasoning section are not necessarily going to facilitate simple mental math, and the exam makers believe that you should remember there's a calculator, so don't handicap yourself by forcing yourself into more complex manipulations mentally than are required by this section of the test. And then always confirm progress to a solution on these questions. You want to allow a maximum of a single calm reread, recalculate, or tactical reset for any of these questions, and consider this the primary format to estimate, eliminate, guess, and move on in under 30 seconds if you're falling behind in pace. These questions don't count for more, but they do generally take more time. So just be judicious in approaching these two-part analysis questions and how much time you spend on them. So let's go ahead and take a look at one more example problem on the whiteboard and see another approach for two-part analysis questions. Okay, so here on the whiteboard, we have another two-part analysis format question, and this is what is known as a logical reasoning style question. And these questions are often quite confusing for GMAT test takers unless they become familiar with them proactively. And the key is to just start writing out notes and trying to consider what the implications almost physically are within the scenario as described. So we're still going to just write out our options here and the question to begin. So provided that each of the above statements is true, select one technician and one marketer who cannot be selected for the committee simultaneously. Select one in each column. So we'll just have M. We'll make that a little bit smaller here than is a very big M. So we'll have an M here, and we got a T over here. And we've got our options, which are R, P, D, G, T, and V. And this matters because the way that it's structured is you don't need to know their names, you just need to know their initials is often how it's going to be set up with these little logical reasoning style questions. So then we've got to consider the rules for the committee. And I'll actually just shift my M over a little bit here so that I give myself a little bit more room to work through the problem. And so a 4-person committee, well, that means that I want to draw out 4 spots. So my N for my committee is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 spots. And that committee is going to be formed from 8 coworkers. And we've got our options, which are PSVT, and they are technicians. So we've got PSVT. And then we've got our marketers, which are DG and R. And then we know that there's one middle manager, Marge, and the committee requires one of each of the employees, or the eligible employee types, to be included. So what that means is that Marge has to be included. So I've got to have M in. And then the remaining spots, there's got to be a technician and there's got to be a marketer. And then the last one is kind of my wild card. It can be anything, but it's only 4 in spots. Then we find that if T is in, so if we get T and T is a technician, then we know that G is in as well, and G is a marketer. And then if V is not in, so if we don't have V, then we can't have R. Now, what that means is we have to consider the opposite outcomes as well. So if, and I should also put in what our categories is. So V is one of our technicians and R is one of our marketers. So if we consider that if T goes in, we have to have G in as well. That means that if G is not in, and of course G was a marketer, then T also cannot be chosen. Similarly, if R is in, then we know that V has to be in as well. Because if R goes in, then V had to be there, because if V is out, R can't go in. So now we're trying to figure out how this all plays with our selections and whether or not we want, we end up with a marketer and a technician where they both can't be in. Well, let's first eliminate from consideration anybody who's not in any of these rules. So we definitely have R in the rule, but P is completely unencumbered. So, and P, of course, is a marketer, is a technician. So that means that we neither have P as a technician or as a marketer. She is completely irrelevant to the problem because she's not involved in these rules at all. Similarly, so is Devin. Devin has no impact on anybody. Devin can do whatever Devin wants to do. So we've got to focus on Reed, Galvin, Tevin, and Val. So R, G, T, and V. Now, if T goes in, we know that G has to go in. And if T and G go in, so we'd have T here and G in, well, then we only have one spot left. And if I were to put R here, we'd have to have V in too, and that can't happen. So that means that if we select T as our technician, we cannot select R as our marketer. And that is how you can work through these unique little logical reasoning scenarios. They function very similarly at the broad strokes to all of our other questions from the 2-part analysis format within the integrated reasoning, but you just have to start working through them, and then oftentimes the result becomes relatively straightforward. But remember, you've got up to 4 minutes to work through a problem like this to best attempt something that will be a little bit strange to start. You just have to begin working through the structure of the problem to reach what is ultimately an unassailable conclusion. So that's our lesson on 2-part analysis questions. Go ahead into our question bank and your own questions to practice more of these and get some additional experience on this question type in the integrated reasoning section.